Okay, thank you very much. You're all very welcome back to the second session we have here today. And our next speaker will be, I'm guessing, very familiar to a lot of you, and that's Tony Fahey. Tony is a Professor Emeritus of Social Policy in UCD, and he's also a board member of Social Justice Ireland. His research deals with a range of social policy topics in Ireland, the EU and the United States, including family patterns and family policy, housing, social inequity and social attitudes. Tony Fahey.
Thank you very much, Mick, and thanks indeed to Social Justice Ireland for the opportunity to talk here today. When Sean Healy asked me to do this, I didn't have to inquire of him, was I being invited as a representative of young people? But nevertheless, I am actually going to talk about something that has a very strong age dimension and is of particular relevance to age differences and the new sets of disadvantages that are facing the rising generation, and it has to do with home ownership and renting. Now, the problem here then is that the private rented sector is booming at the moment. It's doubled roughly since the early 1990s, and Minister Simon Coveney, when he was launching a strategy for the private rented sector in 2016, said that he expected it to double again in the next 20 years. So that would mean that it will have gone over that long period, over the course of a couple of generations, from accounting for about 10% of all households to about 40%. Private renting in my younger days used to be for transitional households, mainly students and young workers, dominated by people in their early to mid-20s. Now it's increasingly for young family households, aged in their 30s and even older. And what I'm concerned about is that if this continued expansion of private renting goes ahead, as is now being anticipated in government circles, this generation of people now in their late 20s, early 30s will be possibly the first generation since the middle of the 20th century to enter middle age, with the majority of them in private rented accommodation. And in that sense, they will be worse off than their parents on two counts. Private renting is far less affordable than the other housing tenures currently available, and it's much more insecure. I keep thinking of this, I don't know if in secondary schools people still learn about the 3 Fs that was talked about in the land war and the land movement in the late 19th century, early 20th century. The 3 Fs were, and some of you here may remember them: fair rent, fixity of tenure, and free sale. Now, the free sale one is interesting because the idea there is that if you're a tenant in a property for a long time, you know, if you spend 20 or 30 or 40 years in a tenancy, you in effect, on a moral basis, get some claim to quasi-ownership of it, and you have something to sell, even if your lease is only a tenancy lease. But nevertheless, that has not yet emerged as an issue in Ireland, because those very long-term tenancies still do not exist in Ireland. But the other two, fair rent and fixity of tenure, are looming again now, 120, 130 years on, are looming again on the horizon as issues for social policy. And I'm going to just talk about this, partly because there's been a lot of talk of solutions for the housing problem, and I point in particular to the National Economic and Social Council, which has done extremely good work on this area. But there still isn't a sense, I think, in the political system of that there is a problem. So I'm going to talk about, first issue is the decline of home ownership and its counterparts, the rise of private renting. Now, this is the long-term trend in the percentage of households that own their own homes, rising from about halfway in 1946 up to roughly 80%. It peaked in 1991. And it has been declining slowly ever since. Now, you might say that this is the peak here in 1991, and it's been going down. Now, and actually this the long-term nature of this decline, I think, is part of the interest, because we think, was it the crisis? Is it the nature of the current recovery? Was it the boom beforehand? In fact, what we're talking about here has been going on continuously through these phases of the economic cycle. So there's something more fundamental going on that isn't just a temporary cyclical thing in the economy. Now, you might say that this isn't very dramatic. It's gone down like this, but this isn't. We're still a long way off the level that was there in the middle of the 20th century. But of course, what changes this picture is that we look at it by age, because it's very unevenly distributed by age. This is the home ownership rate, the percentage of, now I pay attention here to reference persons, or what we used to call household heads, by age. And these are the age groups here, 25 to 34, up to over 65. This shows the percentage of household heads in those age groups who are homeowners. And by homeowners, I mean they're buying either, in a minority of cases, among younger people, they would be outright owners, possibly through inheritance, but in the majority of cases, they would be purchasing on a mortgage. So including mortgage purchasers here. Now, this reached a peak among the youngest age group. This the home ownership rate reached a peak in 1991, as it did for everybody else. And what is striking since is how precipitous the drop has been. It's now down to 30%. This, I think, is one of the great changes that has occurred in Ireland over the last 25 years, and it has drawn very little attention. Now, it's being followed by the next age group, 35 to 44, where it was about 83% in 1991 and is now down to 61, 62%. And again, now these are this age group in particular, you might say, 35 to 44, this is the family formation ages. These are not young students or young workers. And even here, this age group, they're no longer quite young students and young workers. In the past, you know, average age of marriage, 28, 29, average age of first birth around 30. So you're talking about the age groups which are entering family formation. And they're now increasingly in private rented accommodation. Now, what is the counterpart of this decline here is the other block of people in these groups. It's largely the growth of private renting, and that the social housing stock has remained static over this period. In fact, it's declined very slightly. So what's happening with this decline in home ownership is a very rapid growth in private renting. Now, one of the things of interest here, I look particularly at, say, this age group, 25 to 34, in the year 2006. If we go back to the gap between, say, 1991 and 2002, the 69% who were homeowners at that point, over the following 10 years, they increased their home ownership rate very substantially. But as we move on in time, when we look, say, 2006 to 2016, those who, the percentage of 25 to 34-year-olds who were homeowners in 2006 had made very little gain over the following 10 years. So there was a sense there that this is a static picture which is going to go ahead, which is going to persist. And what we're talking about here, if Minister Coveney is correct in saying that private renting is going to double in the future, it's largely going to be driven by these age groups here who remain in private renting, or at least exit out of it into either social housing or home ownership at a relatively slow rate. And so it's on the basis that already, if you take this 30% here who are homeowners, the other 70% are made up of about 8 or 9% who are in social housing and 60% in private renting. So that's 60% in private renting, aged 25 to 34. They may be, as I say, the first generation who enter, you know, by the time they're in their late 30s, early 40s, into their 50s. They may well be the first, unless things change, unless the direction of events change, they'll be the first generation since the middle of the 20th century to enter middle age with possibly a majority, or certainly a very large minority, in private renting. Now, another way of looking at this is some data produced here by this is a graph produced by the Central Statistics Office based on the censuses of 1991 and 2016. This is the number of households who rent by age. So this is the number of renters distributed by age in 1991. There was 81,600 private renters in 1991, and you see the big bulge that has occurred over the 25 years since then. And so there is now this big bulge, and the peak ages here were 25, 26, 27. Now the peak ages are 30, 31, 32, 33. So again, it's the numbers are increasing and the age profile is rising, is aging. And we have a large segment then, a large numbers of householders in these older ages who are private renting. So there's now 320,000 private renters compared to 81,600 in 1991. It's not quite a fourfold increase, but it's not far off it. So what's the problem about this? Why is it a concern? Oh, well, actually, one other point that I want to talk about is the consequence. And I must say I have more of a leaning towards the social virtues of home ownership than a lot of my colleagues in social policy analysis. And this graph here is one of the reasons why. It has to do with wealth distribution. The main form of wealth holding in Ireland today generally is housing wealth. And the system of supports for home purchase, which produced the 80% home ownership rate in 1991. It was very much tilted towards enabling low-income households to buy their own homes. Now, in fact, one of the main drivers of it was the sale of tenant purchase of local authority housing. That was one of the main mechanisms by which ordinary working class families could become homeowners. And it did have the consequence then, this is dated from the year 2000, that the distribution of housing wealth, if we say the bottom income quintile, in other words, the people who are the bottom 20% who are in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, they only had 7.3% of income, but they had 15% of housing wealth. So housing wealth was more evenly distributed than income was. And I must say, I think this is a significant form of social equality that had emerged in Ireland by the end of the 20th century, that, in my view, had a lot of benefits. People almost tend to dismiss home ownership as some kind of an obsession that people have, an unreasonable obsession. But it is Thomas Piketty's book on capital was driven, his whole analysis of rising inequalities was driven very much by inequalities of wealth holdings, that inequalities of income were a function of inequalities of wealth holding. And I think it was one of the achievements of the Irish social policy system in the 20th century that it delivered this level of equality in wealth holdings. See, the top income category here, they had 40% of the income, but they had 25% of the wealth, which was a bit disproportionate, but it wasn't nearly as proportionate as their share of income. So this is now what we are moving away from. And the growth in private renting is going to dismantle this. And in fact, it may exacerbate income inequalities because it means that low-income households, or certainly those in the bottom 10, 20, 30% of the income distribution, are now likely to be facing into a lifetime of having to pay fairly substantial rents, which is a drain on income. And that would have implications for current inequalities and current living standards. Now, similar about the young and the elderly, the older people here had very little income, but they had substantially more housing wealth. So housing was under 35s at 25% of the income, but less than. So there was an age equality, and in fact, in the long run, it is one of the guarantees of living standards in older age that people in older age own their own housing, not necessarily because it enhances their income, but because it eliminates a very big draw on income, namely having to pay rent. So one of the reasons then to be concerned about this is this notion of the rising cost of housing. And here we have a graph that looks at the rent or mortgage payments as a percentage of household expenditures going back. Now we're going back here to the 1970s. We have data from the Household Budget Service that tracked this over time. Now what is striking here is that in the 1970s, 80s, and right up until the early 1990s, up to the 1980s at least, there was always a gap. Private renters were always spending more of their outgoings every week on housing costs, on these housing costs, than either were social housing tenants or home purchasers. But beginning in 1987, now, and it's interesting that this has, when I say this is a long-term trend, it has been going on now for 30 years. And a lot of it was driven by the adjustment to the fiscal crisis of the late 1980s. And in fact, this is the 31st annual conference of the Social Policy of Social Justice Ireland. So if this is the 31st and they've had one every year, it means that their first conference was in 1987. And 1987 was a very important turning point in housing policy in Ireland, and its reverberations are still echoing down through the years. And it had to do with the withdrawal of the state from social housing and from local authorities were big givers of mortgages to low-income households until the 1987 crisis, and they've since withdrawn. And so there is often, I know that there was some comment here about neoliberalism in the Irish welfare state, and I think that actually in most areas of the Irish welfare state, neoliberalism hasn't dramatically changed the structure of provision in, say, social security, education and health, but housing is one area where it has. And I think since 1987, the degree of change which has occurred in Irish national housing policy is more dramatic than in any other area of domestic, of social policy. And so since 1987, then, the share of household spending that is devoted to rents has doubled. It was around 13% in the late 80s, and it's now 27%. So the average private renter is spending 27% of their outgoings on rent. Now, since what we see here is perhaps the consequence of the economic crisis and the boom in house prices that occurred in the run-up to then, and the number of households which found themselves very stressed by mortgage payments. And so there was a big increase between 2004 and 5 and 2009 and 10 in the share of mortgages going on or the share of homeowners with mortgages, how much they have to spend on mortgages. Also an interesting increase here in social rent costs, which I must say I hadn't noticed before until I did this a few days ago, and I don't entirely know what the explanation for it is. It is a very significant thing in its own right. So here we've had a general rise in housing costs for everybody, but it was preceded by some 20 years prior to that by a rising cost for private renters. Now, this generation of private renters who's now moving into middle age, renting their homes, there's a dimension of inequality here. They're spending far more on their housing than are the other tenure categories. Now, there's a lot of inequality here. Owners with a mortgage, some of them are doing fine. They're coming to the end of their mortgages and they haven't much to pay. Others are fairly recent households that paid an awful lot and maybe are very stressed. But one of the great things about mortgage payments is that they're time limited. You know, by the time you're in your late 50s, if you started in your 20s or 30s, you're looking forward to the day when you're no longer paying any mortgages. Whereas if you're private renting, if you're hit 30 and you say, I'm facing a lifetime in private renting, you could be paying the same level of rents in 40 years' time, and there's no termination to it. So that's a very significant thing. Now, it has given rise, I think the lack of policy response to this has been quite striking. It did give some rise to some response in the strategy for the rental sector, which was published in 2016, and it was actually at the launch of that strategy that Minister Coveney, who at the time was Minister responsible for housing, it was then that he made the remarks that he expected the private rented sector to double to 40% of all households within the coming 20 years. Now, the degree of acceptance of rent increases, the striking thing about that strategy was that it accepted that rent increases were going to be normal. And when it came to a question of rent controls, the rent control was limits to rates of increase. It aimed to slow down the rate of increase, not prevent increase, nor much less bring about decrease. In fact, you could have argued that the purpose of policy now should be to narrow that inequality gap which is opened up between private renters and everybody else, and that would entail bringing down rent costs, not slowing down the rate at which they increased. And the only measure that was introduced at the time was to introduce this idea of rent pressure zones, which were areas of the country with above average rents which had experienced more than 7% rent inflation in the years preceding the introduction of the policy. And they're mainly in Dublin, Cork and Galway, and outside the Greater Dublin area in Meath, Kildare, County Louth and so on. So very limited application. And the Minister, it's capped to cap rent increases to 4% per year. Now that's an extraordinarily high rate of increase. It means that rents will double every 21 years. So it's accepting, it's sort of solidifying the notion that we should expect rents to continue to increase. And even at that, he was reassuring people, we're only going to do this for 3 years. It's on the basis that we don't want to scare off private investors. We want to grow the private rented market. We want to guarantee a good rate of return. We want to guarantee a rate of return that increases every year, which is quite extraordinary. It is and this is where I say that it is in this area that policy has changed so dramatically, because we had spent the previous 100 years prior to the end of the 1980s sort of accepting that landlordism was a bad thing. It was exploitative. It drove people into poverty. It gave them very poor security of occupation. And suddenly we have gone 100% around in the other direction and now say that landlordism is a good thing and we should cultivate it and we should be careful of the private investor. So tenure, some marginal improvements in security as well, and I'll talk about them again in a minute. But the long-term aim of leases, let me just move on to that actually, tenancy conditions. So this apart from cost, the other big issue in the private rented sector is insecurity of tenure. Now, until the residential owner occupation, historically, one of the big arguments, one of the big drivers of the land movement and of the campaign to introduce tenant purchase of local authority housing in the 1930s and so on, was that owner occupation was the most secure form of occupation of housing, in that it gave security of tenure and a guarantee of affordability, that you weren't going to hit the age of 60 and suddenly be faced with a big increase or any outgoings at all for your housing. Social housing also had two of the great strengths of social housing were that it had lifetime tenancies. In fact, tenancies in the Irish social housing system are heritable, in that if a child of the tenant is living in the dwelling, when the original tenant dies, that child can carry on the lease. So at least lifetime tenancies and affordable rents, and it was built into the system in Ireland a differential rent scheme, that rents are charged on the basis of ability to pay rather than producing a rate of return on the investment for the landlord. Now, private renting then, the Residential Tenancies Act of 2004 introduced 4-year leases. Now, previously there were virtually tenancies at will. And so the Residential Tenancies Act introduced a 4-year lease. That was amended to 6 years in 2016, and the strategy for the rental sector, one of its contribution to security of tenure was to increase tenancies from 4 years to 6 years. Now, 6 years might be all right for, a 22-year-old worker who's just got their first job in Dublin and are working in Google and they don't know where they're going to be in 4 years' time. But if you're 32 or 33 years of age and you're settled down and you have your first child, and you're now faced with a situation, the first child is born, by the time that child is at first class in primary school, you don't know where you're going to be living, because you don't have any guarantee of security of tenure. So, and on top of that, there are exemptions to allow early terminations of leases on behalf of the landlord. So if the landlord wants to take the dwelling back for his own family, or he wants to sell the dwelling, or wants to refurbish the dwelling, the landlord can terminate the lease. So you don't even have the security of a 6-year, a meaningful guarantee of 6 years. And then the strategy for the rental sector did talk about the desirability of having leases of indefinite duration, but said we'll try to move towards that in the long run. And so it does mean, and this is where when I say that on those two counts of fair rent and fixity of tenure, we aren't that far away from the situation that was there when the land campaign started up in the late 19th century, and where a lot of the policy on both that eventually transmuted into policy on housing, and we're now heading back towards a revival of those issues in the political scene in Ireland. Now, one thing I'll just talk about very quickly, rent supports for low-income tenants, to mitigate the pressures that have arisen from this growth of the private rented sector. What has grown since 1987, and it really was in the 1990s that this started to emerge, that the state now gives subventions to private tenants who cannot afford their rents. The early form of this was the rent supplement, a measure that was actually legislated for in 1978, but it really only began to become a big part of the system in the 1990s. As social housing dried up and the traditional clientele for social housing ended up in the private rented sector. And rent supplements were directed at welfare-dependent households. In other words, you could only get these subventions if you were not in employment. actually one of the big categories that ended up being recipients of rent supplements were lone parents. And so, in fact, an awful lot of these rent supports, the biggest family category in this sector is the lone parent families. But then, this is rent supplements introduced in 1978. There's now 37,000 units receiving rent supplements, and then new ones that were introduced more recently, the HAP, Housing Assistance Payment, and the Residential Accommodation Scheme. They are designed to provide supplementation to people who are not welfare dependent. In other words, you can have a job and still get this supplementation. So they're designed as well for supplementation of tenants in low-income employment, and there's now 45,000 of these. So taking the whole system of socially supported housing, which used to be concentrated really on social housing, there is now a broader range of types of social supports. There's about 250,000 households receiving some kind of social support. Some 142,000 in local authorities, 30,000 in approved housing bodies, and then these two categories here. Together they amount to 15% of the housing stock. So the entire broader socially supported sector consists of about 15% of the housing stock, of which roughly 10% are in social housing and 5% are state-supported tenants in the private rented sector. And those tenants in the private rented sector account for a quarter of all private rented units. So a quarter of the private rented sector is now getting state support with their rent. Now, there's a lot of it's a good thing that those supports are there. The situation would be far worse if they weren't there, but it's a difficult policy to implement effectively. It's full of risks and contrary influences that you're trying to avoid. And one of the big difficulties is balancing adequacy of the rent support, in other words, really support people who need it, versus the counter risk of driving up rents. And when you are active in 25% of the market, you are a big enough player to influence overall rents. And so if they're too mean, it means that the households are not being adequately supported. And indeed, some of the homelessness that we experience today is because people who are in private rented accommodation, the rents ran ahead of their ability to pay, and the HAP or RAS payments weren't enough to meet the difference. And so they simply lost their homes. So a lot of the increase in homelessness is driven by this difficult balancing act. And it's almost inevitable that HAP payments have to be a bit below what is needed. Because if they rise up to what is needed, then it'll simply push up the overall rental rate, and it could end up being a pretty crushing burden on the taxpayer. There are long-term implications if the system continues to expand, and so we end up with 40% in the total private rented sector, and a quarter of those are in rent supplementation. It will, in effect, double the number of households who are getting HAP payments. And these are really, you could say, subventions to private landlords, and you could argue that there's better ways of spending the money. And of course, one of the big questions is implications for pensions. The pension system in Ireland is based on the assumption that pensioners don't have rent to pay, and they don't really have significant mortgage payments. As it stands at the moment, something like over 80% of older people are homeowners. I think it's 82 or 83% at the moment, and 90. It's virtually up at 90%, and the 10% who are not homeowners are in social housing. I think it's about 2% of the population aged over 65 are in accommodation other than home ownership or social housing. And so the pension system we have is the social welfare pensions are based on the presumption that people in those ages are not facing substantial housing costs. And that will change over time. And there is, I think, a possible contradiction now between, on the one hand, government is encouraging people to save, invest in pension funds in the future, but at the same time discouraging them from buying their own homes. And it could well be that, in fact, the traditional approach, which was to depend very heavily on social welfare pensions, but make sure you owned your own home by the time you were 65, that is another way of achieving a very similar outcome. So let me finish on that. I think this is a very significant development in the Irish welfare state. And it actually puzzles me that this very dramatic turnaround in policy has occurred with so little kickback from the public. We are now focused on homelessness, and people are very concerned about it, and rightly so. But the 10,000 people, or what Sean Healy will say is 11, or many others may well be 11,000 people who are homeless, they're only the extreme, acute end of a much more generic population. There's now 750,000 people in private rented accommodation. By no means all of them are in difficulty, but the general level of pressure that's on them from housing, from both rent costs and insecurity, is far greater than it is for any other sector of Irish society. So it is a new dimension of inequality, and government is more or less accepting that this is likely to grow. So it is a big issue, and fundamentally, I think what policy needs to do is turn back again. Maybe not exactly onto the same tracks that were there before. And here I would, again, I'm not going to go into all of the solutions that have been proposed, because there have been many of them very well proposed by many people, but they simply aren't getting the hearing in the public that I think they deserve. An increase in social housing, creating this idea of a new cost rental sector, conditional subsidies to landlords. Conditional, in other words, tax breaks or subsidies, conditional on security conditions and rent conditions being favourable to the tenant, and maybe a return to home purchase supports for low-income households, and the Rebuilding Ireland home loans that were introduced in February 2018 may be a first step in that direction. And I'll better leave it at that. Thank you very
much. Tony, thank you very much, and definitely an eye-opener, as you say. We sometimes, and I think perhaps us in the media are sometimes guilty of focusing on the emotional element of things rather than the reason, and that's perhaps why, as you say, quite obviously the homelessness issue gets proportionately far greater attention than what is, again, another aspect of sort of hidden hardship and hidden inequality that's very much growing. I'm sure there's people out there who have questions in relation to this. Yes, one gentleman here, we can start off. We got a. Do you?
Sorry to ask another question, Jerry. I'm sorry to be so vocal, but I found it a fascinating talk, and I have three quick questions for you. Number one, you said about decreasing rent. Well, it struck me Stony Batter, where I come from, where it's gone up from 1,000 in a short few years to 2,000 a month to rent. How can the government step in to decrease rent? Are we talking about big constitutional change there? Second question is with regard to land. If the government owns all this land, how can they protect that as a valuable asset while allowing private developers to build on it? And the last question is, you mentioned, is about ghettoization. If people are allowed buy their own homes in social housing areas, do often the cornerstone of those communities then move out, and does it lead to ghettoization? I'm sorry for asking so many questions, but thank you very much for your talk.
Go ahead, Tony.
First on decreasing rents. Now the government's, I think quite rightly, is saying is one of the first things that needs to be done is simply to increase the supply, that market forces will do something in that direction. In other words, if what's driving up rents at the moment is scarcity, and if housing was more abundantly available, the rate of increase would drop off. Now there is some truth in that, but it won't do the whole thing. Now the other measures that were there in the past, the other big measure was a much larger social housing sector. Simply take a lot of the demand out of the private market and put it into a social sector. So a big increase in social housing is one obvious one. And that has its knock-on effects, because it reduces demand in the private sector, and it tends to pull down rents in the private sector, particularly at the lower end. This idea of conditional subsidies, tax breaks, or subsidies for private landlords, which has been floated by NESC, and it's the conditionality in those countries which have very large private rented sectors, like Germany and Switzerland. There is a very elaborate systems of tax subsidisation or direct grant subsidisation of the private rented sector, all geared to making sure that rent costs, that the subsidies to the landlord are passed on to the tenant. And the tenant has both security of tenure and a reasonable level of rent affordability. And then the third one about ghettoization. I must say I think that this whole business of ghettoization has been vastly overstated in Ireland. When the very big local authority estates were built in Ireland in the past, and I saw an account recently of West Talla, which was built between 1979 and 1984. There was 4,500 households built in 5 years. At the time, it was the same size as Mullingar and Tullamore combined. It was 99.9% private. And it has worked. And in fact, nowadays, it is 50% owned, because a lot of, not tenant purchase was declining at the time, but a lot of private developers, there was a lot of infill housing spaces that could be developed. The private developers came in afterwards. And within 20 years of West Talla being created as a single tenure housing estate comprised entirely of local authority dwellings, you had very substantial element of private residential housing, and I think 60% of the households now in West Talla are owner-occupiers. And so the mixing that has occurred in the Irish system, even in, think of Cabra, think of Crumlin, think of Donecarney, all of these places that started life as 100% local authority estates, or virtually 100%, they have worked extremely well and have knit very well into the urban fabric.
Thank you.
Kitty, if we might...
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that stigmatisation of social housing, and do you think there's enough of a challenge that? But the other thing I wanted to ask is, when in the next 30, 40 years do you think we're going to, if things don't change, are we going to reach that tipping point that you alluded to, where a majority or even a significant proportion of pensioners are going to be private rented? Where you said we're entering into a phase now where the majority are not transitioning from private rent into home ownership. When do you think that's coming?
I think it will. It won't. It will take. It's a slow developer. In fact, this is one of the things about the nature of the housing stock, and it's one of the reasons why you need to look over the long term. It took a long time to move from, say, 50% home ownership in 1946 to 80% in 1991. So it won't happen in the next 20 years. But you may soon begin to have small numbers of people who are entering older age and paying substantial rent. And I must say, my prediction would be that there will be a general election, maybe not the next one, but possibly the one after that, where this whole business of, again, the 3 Fs could become a major plank of political mobilisation. Not for people on the margins, because it will now increasingly be affecting the middle ground. And so I expect actually that it won't, the track we're on at the moment will not continue, because there's too strong a history in Ireland of resistance to this kind of thing for it to drop away so easily. It did drop away over the last 20 years, but I will be really astonished if it doesn't come roaring back onto the centre of the political stage in the very near future.
But if we continue, just to sort of send a warning shot, if it does continue, we're looking at maybe in 30, 35 years, you're going to start to see people going into their pension 8 years, paying whatever, a half or two, even more of their pension income.
Yes, and this is then when the housing assistance payment, the housing assistance payment at the moment is going mainly to people in their 20s and 30s and early 40s. If you had a situation where a substantial chunk of the pensioner population became dependent on housing assistance payment. This is the difficulty about the housing assistance payment. It could grow and grow and grow the bigger the sector becomes, and particularly if it becomes, the thing about pensioners is that they're all modest incomes. The social welfare pension is a very modest income, and you could have a situation where the majority of the pension population would be on housing assistance payment. And once that happens, then the potential for the housing assistance payment to balloon into a major element of current expenditure becomes very real. And the counter What we should be doing is anticipating this and saying, let's spend it now on the capital front. Because if you mobilise the capital now and build social housing or build cost rental private housing, you know, it could be various forms of quasi-private landlords who get various kinds of state subvention, but on the basis that the rents they charge are a function of the cost of the dwelling, not a function of the current state of the housing market. And so you have a predictability, because you know from day one what the dwelling cost to build, and so you then have a degree of predictability as to what the rent will be in 30 years' time, whereas if you leave it to the market, you don't know what way the market is going to move over time. So it is a question of perhaps saying, rather than storing this up for the future as a current cost that will have to be dealt with in every budget, the argument is to say, bring it back into the capital budget, which is what we always did in the past. Handle housing primarily under the capital budget and not be dependent on subventions to current income.
I'll ask you a quick thing, Tony, just in relation to, as you said, and from social policy point of view, the positives of home ownership. Even if all of the measures that you mentioned were implemented and there was a change of direction, is it realistic that we could go back to, for example, the peak period you mentioned in 91, that type of thing, or is this just a question of arresting the decline of the availability of home ownership for a large proportion?
There is an argument that the level of home ownership that was there in 1991 was too high, that there were people buying houses to live in when in fact they would have preferred to rent. In other words, they weren't yet settled down. And the only reason they bought was that it was it made more sense. And increasingly we have lone person households or transient households of one sort or another, you know, workers coming in to work in Google from abroad and they don't know where they're going to be in 5 years' time. And you do need a stronger private rental sector. So perhaps it was too high. But the idea that it becomes a norm for midlife households raising families who don't have either security of tenure or security of rent, security of housing costs, or the government talks about predictability. It isn't enough to have predictability. If the prediction is it's going to go up by 4% every year, then that's not much help. This notion of affordability for housing, which is a big policy issue in a lot of countries, you know, you get these rules of thumb that anyone who's spending more than 25% of their income on rent or housing costs, that's an affordability pressure, and you have to try to keep it below that threshold. So setting a threshold and say we must try to keep housing costs below that threshold, that would be what we'd be talking about. And it is not necessary. Home ownership isn't the only way of doing this. Social housing is a pretty good approximation, but it is in itself a very subvented form of housing.
I just will have two very quickly. It's just we're under a small bit of time pressure, Donald, and I think we had this man here as well. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll take the two here, and okay, we'll take two here first, then we'll extend it a small bit. Yeah, we've two here. Shoot.
I just wanted to know, what do we know about the landlords? We've spoken about the private rented sector as if it's a uniform sector, and I wonder, are there various policy interventions that are required? I'm thinking that in some cases you'd have sort of a local entrepreneur who might own an apartment on top of his own house. Renting it is quite a different thing than a pension fund owning an apartment block. So I wonder, have we any sense of what the shape of the landlord is, if you like?
Yeah. I just take one with that there. There's another gentleman. Was there someone there? Sorry, I thought you.
I just have a quick question with regards to the destigmatisation of housing, of social housing. Do you think that it's achievable to have a system of social housing in Ireland that is widespread rather than just for working class areas? Because it seems, at least in my experience and my view, that social housing is severely stigmatised in this country, and I'm just wondering if you think it's possible to expand the social housing beyond that.
Yeah, okay. Just on the question of landlords, we do know a lot about landlords, and we do know that the vast majority of them are very small landlords. And it's only recently that we begin to see, for the first time in 2 or 3 generations, significant large institutions emerging on the scene. One of them, of course, is IRA's REIT, the Irish Residential IRES, Irish Residential Property Residential Real Estate Investment Trust. Now they were started up in 2015, and by this summer they own 2,600 dwellings. Earlier this summer also we had the spectacle of the Irish Life Investment Managers buying an apartment development of 262 apartments up in, I think it was up in Sandyford. So we're beginning now to see the emergence of large private investors in the area. And it actually, the strategy for the private rental sector, and in fact even the legalisation of REITs, seem to sort of welcome this. And this is actually, again, why I find this so puzzling. Why should we be welcoming this on this scale? And what's attracting these investors into the market is the prospect of very good returns in an international environment where the rate of return on capital investment is very poor. And we now have a situation where there are investors in California or Bangkok or Hong Kong who are interested in rents in Finglas and Sandyford because they're investors in the Irish housing market. It's a very small development still. I'd say there's only about 3,000 or 4,000 units that are now owned by the larger investors. It's still dominated by the smaller investor, although I think we overestimate the degree to which large investors are present in the housing market in any European country. It seems actually to be a fairly general international pattern. In some countries you get up to a quarter or a third of rental housing owned by large investors, but the majority landlord in most of Europe, even in countries with large private rented sectors, is the small landlord.
Okay.
The social housing one. Again, I would think that the social housing stigma, you know, in the 1970s, a third of housing in Ireland was being built by local authorities. And we didn't realise that because they were selling it off to the residents. And so they were generating a social mix in the area. You know, in all local authority estates within 10 or 15 years, you had a mix of private owners and tenants. So we had it in the past. No, Crumlin, I know Crumlin reasonably well. My sister bought a house there about 30 years ago, and she paid a premium for it because it was built by Dublin Corporation, as it was. They were felt to be better quality houses than what was available in the private market. Crumlin Cabra is another instance of a place where, you know, people forget that it was social housing. So this notion that social housing is stigmatised is a very recent development. And if the sheer scale of it increases, then of course it becomes much more diversified in the type of residence that it has.
I know there are many people who want to get in, but unfortunately the clock is our enemy once more, because this obviously is, not just here, but I think nationally, one of the great topics at the moment. And I think Tony's contribution there certainly elucidated an awful lot of it. Could you please thank Tony Fahey for that? Thanks.